Welcome to Songs and Stories from Home. That's the first verse and the chorus of the song Don't Wake Me If I'm Dreamin'. I Can Use the Memories. McCoy and I recorded it at a concert in 1980 and put it on a cassette in early 81. In the next few Dear Partner letters, I'll be sharing some of our adventures and misadventures, musical and otherwise, from the 1980s. Dear Partner, the late 80s tour with the Brothers Four in the summer of 1979 gave me some confidence. It also put me back on my feet financially. Our friend Gary Drager had recently gotten married and rented me his place on Eastlake at a family rate. I fell in love. I started seeing a way forward. Although at times it felt like choosing between heating and eating, I decided to focus on trying to succeed primarily as a songwriter. When Bob Dylan's brother, David Zimmerman, was my manager, he told me Dylan spent 6 hours a day writing songs. And I'll say my quest to follow his example has haunted and inspired me my whole career. And I'll also add that I didn't fully appreciate the old maxim that says you can make a killing as a songwriter. You just can't make a living. Not giving up on the idea of ultimately being considered a singer-songwriter, my normal routine was to write one song for me to sing and then the next one for sale. Back and forth. It would take a while longer to realize it's better for me to write from the heart than for the market. There are different schools of thought when it comes to presenting songs to publishers. One is to keep it simple, for instance, just voice and guitar. The other is to add instruments and present a more polished and complete demo. In 1980, I decided to try the more complete demo route. While putting the pieces of my life back together, in retrospect, one piece was missing, and that was confidence to go into the studio or onto the stage by myself. You were ready to lend a hand in your voice, as well as that laugh of yours when things got too serious. We found a small and obscure recording studio on Queen Anne Hill. Nice guys with hefty dreams. They called their place Big and Famous. They knew a group of musicians for us to work with. Drager, playing the role of producer, added his artistic magic. He'd become well known as a children's book author and under the name Cooper Edens. He loved music, and after working with us, ended up spending a lot of the 80s working with young Seattle musicians. The way he tells it, he was in L.A. mulling a major label deal for one of the groups when the Seattle grunge scene took off and left Drager's group unsigned and Drager trying to figure out what to do next. A few days before one of my planned trips to Nashville, Drager and I met at Big and Famous. It was Sunday morning, May 18th. We'd mix a song and then turn on a small black and white TV to get updates on the eruption of Mount St. Helens. One strange day. The results of the Nashville trip, like many that followed, were inconclusive. A few doors opened with one publisher promising to get Don't Wake Me If I'm Dreamin' onto Anne Murray's desk. After seeing a show with Pat Sands at the Seattle Concert Theater, we rented the place for our own show on Saturday, Flag Day, June 14th. Sellout crowd. A few days earlier, you and I appeared on the Seattle Today show. The other guests were G. Gordon Liddy of Watergate fame and Wally Amos, who was promoting his famous Amos cookies. When he opened a bag and offered samples, I quickly scarfed down a few, conveniently forgetting I was in the middle of the second week of the Scarsdale diet, made famous by Dr. Herman Tarnauer, who had been murdered by his mistress, Jean Harris, a few weeks earlier. You built your log house later that summer with the help of your wife, father-in-law, and a collection of volunteers. I was a part of it for the first 6 weeks. I even had a nickname, Otto. My last day was as unexpected as it was unforgettable. We'd stacked logs one by one till together they reached the height of 8 or 9 feet. Our job that way that day was to each hoist a 12 by 12 beam that together ran across the width of the house, and then Kate and her dad would place a support beam beneath the two of them. Together they would become the main support beams for what would become the second floor. You and I are standing nose to nose, counting to 3 before giving it all we've got. What we hadn't counted on was that as the walls were rising, the logs had imperceptibly sagged inward, making the job of getting the two beams together and high enough to get a support beam underneath them monumental. A few tries into it, we were almost there when you stepped into a hole that was destined to become the stairwell to the basement. Your nearly instantaneous jump to safety meant the weight of the beams ended up on my shoulders. Surveying the aftermath, there was a lot of relief that we both made it. Not much worse for wear. And after taking a break, we stayed at it long enough to raise high the roof beams with the support beams safely underneath. And when that was done, I was done. A month later, I came back to see how things were going. You were on the roof wearing a tool belt. Looked somehow cool, pounding on shingles, moving with ease. Seeing you there, the sun behind you, you appeared somehow different. As if in the course of that summer you'd grown into a part of yourself. A part of you that these days builds guitars and gives them away to kids that need them. At that moment, it was enough to look up, to see you, and to know not only were you putting a roof on a house, but at that moment you were on your way home. In 1981, I established a relationship with a small publisher in Nashville that would last for more than 10 years. The first weekend in April, you and I did 2 sold-out nights at the Seattle Concert Theater. We wondered whether the shows would go on after President Reagan was shot earlier that week. Unusual times. John Lennon, the president, and then the Pope. Our musical collaboration got more serious when we signed a record deal. A small label, but a deal nonetheless. Bob Flick agreed to produce it. One of these letters is going to talk more about Bob and how important he's been to my life and career, to both our lives and our careers. Back then, besides singing in the Brothers Four, his other ventures and adventures included writing and producing award-winning commercials. He discovered and worked with the best musicians in the Northwest, and he'd be bringing them in to play on our album, one we would end up calling Between Friends. The recording was scheduled for 3 days in early September. The plan was to do the recording in Studio A at Case Smith, big time. There would be a day of rehearsal and 2 days of recording that would include a group of friends there each night as a live audience. We chose 12 songs to put on the album. At rehearsal, we bogged down on the 7th song. A decision was made to go home without running through the remaining tunes. That uncertainty added a certain level of anxiety. Earlier in the day, my dad had called. He was flying into Seattle from Europe on his way to Spokane. And while his arrival was totally unexpected, I told myself it could be a gift to have him there for this big moment. My older brother picked him up at the airport and dropped him off at the studio just as the rehearsal was finishing up. When my dad and I got back to my place, it was clear he was in distress. Over the next couple of hours, he talked about all that he had built financially before he and my mom left for overseas was crumbling. He was likely to lose everything. In so many ways, my dad was and remains my hero, a role model on how to be a good and decent man. He loved to laugh. He seldom cried in front of me. This was one of those times. Around midnight, I offered him my bed while I took the couch in the living room. Several times I heard him get out of bed and pace. One time, he let me put my arms around him and hold him. It was the only time in my life that I held him in that way. I shared his despair as best I could. Early the next morning, we walked a few blocks to Lake Union. As the day awakened, we found a bench. I have little memory of how the rest of the day went. My dad was there for the first half of the recording session that evening, sitting in front of me. The band was as good as promised. Yours and my rehearsals of the song paid off in the performances. We were going to have our album. On a break, I said goodbye to my dad, who would be flying into Spokane in an uncertain future. A good friend took him to the airport. I would be driving to Spokane to be with him in a couple of days. At that time, Pat and her husband John owned a restaurant on Capitol Hill. They closed the place early that night so that we could invite everyone up there to celebrate. It was, as my father would say, great. And toward the end of the evening, you and I ended up on the back porch. John had given us each 2 bottles of Heineken beer. I quickly drank one down, put it down, held the other, while all that had happened over the previous 24 hours came pouring out. For the first time in my life, I knew what it was like to laugh as loud as I could while at the same time crying as hard as I knew how. Such joy and such sorrow alive in that moment. A moment we shared. And then we rose and turned toward the door into all that was going to happen. Thinking back now to the fall of 1981, when we recorded Between Friends. And I remember all those fears and the doubts, and also how my dad was struggling back then. And when it was over, looking back at what we'd done, and as far as my dad, what I couldn't do, and how the emotions came pouring out like mad on the back steps of that restaurant, sitting there with you. And I'm laughing as loud as I know how, crying as hard as I can. The joy and sorrow are so close together. I don't know where one stops and the other begins. Life is suspended in that one moment as it waits to be defined. It's all over